Welcome back. Today we're going to be covering a somewhat dark subject sent to me by SharpClaw01 on Twitter. Please go follow them. The subject in question is a now 19-year-old man who was groomed online and abused by 21 men, being told by a government agency that he consented to the sex and is now denied compensation for what he went through. This is going to be a very interesting one. And just before we dive into the article, I want to make it clear I have some very strong opinions on this particular subject. But I'm going to focus on the facts first, and maybe later, if I can remember at all, I will mention what I think of this. Man who was sexually abused as a 13-year-old is denied compensation. A man groomed online and sexually abused by a string of older men when he was 13 has been denied compensation because the agency that handles claims say he consented to the assaults. With this nugget of information, we should now have a look at the UK's law on consent and what constitutes rape. Sexual Offences Act 2003. Child sex offences. Sexual activity with a child. 1. A person aged 18 or over, A, commits an offence if he intentionally touches another person, B. For the sake of this video, I am going to ignore the gendered language and continue with this law. The touching is sexual and either B is under 16 and A does not reasonably believe that B is 16 or over, or B is under 13. 2. A person guilty of an offence under this section if the touching involved penetration of B's anus or vagina with a part of A's body or anything else, penetration of B's mouth with A's penis, penetration of A's anus or vagina with a part of B's body, or penetration of A's mouth with B's penis, is liable on conviction on indictment to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 14 years. 3. Unless subsection 2 applies, a person guilty of an offence under this section is liable, on summary conviction, to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 6 months or to a fine not exceeding the statutory maximum or both. B. On conviction on indictment to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 14 years. 10. Causing or inciting a child to engage in sexual activity. 1. A person aged 18 or over commits an offence if he intentionally causes or incites another person to engage in an activity. The activity is sexual and either B. The child is under 16 and A does not reasonably believe that B is 16 or over, or B is under 13. Now I could continue reading from the Sexual Offences Act, but the punishments and the scenarios are similar for all the categories, and they would go past the child sex offences that are relevant to this video. So instead I would like to ask a question. Do you, the CICA that handles the compensation claim, believe that a 13-year-old could give consent when the law states what I've already mentioned? Peter, who is now 19, was abused by 21 men, 2 of them teachers, who all acted independently. They were found guilty of charges including sexual activity with a child, causing or inciting a child to engage in sexual activity, and meeting a child after sexual grooming. A judge who presided over most of the cases made it clear that Peter was not to blame, describing the actions of one perpetrator as vile and depraved. But the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority, the government agency that makes financial awards to victims of violent crime, has refused Peter compensation on the grounds that he willingly met the men after registering on websites for over 18s, had not been manipulated, and consented in fact to the sexual contact. As we are back on the subject of consent, I feel it right to talk about the age of consent. Now, I'm going to go with Wikipedia's first paragraph on this because it is somewhat accurate and does lead to legal competence, which I think is also important. The age of consent is the age at which a person is considered to be legally competent to consent to sexual acts, and is thus the minimum age of a person with whom another person is legally permitted to engage in sexual activity. Now, legally competent is one's mental capacity to partake or participate in transactions, activities, or legal proceedings. Now, this circles around the idea of mental function integrity, which is where the brain is at a certain mature level to be able to make informed decisions, like, for example, sex. Now, when we go back to the CICA and they decide that he did consent because of those factors of him looking for sex, when the courts have already made it quite clear he is not to blame, the CICA have basically played the victim blaming card and made it all his fault when he was not old enough to make any informed decision in this area. Now, his sexuality, this kid's sexuality, does come up, and I think it's one of those moments where being gay and so young and trying to understand yourself does play a part, but it is not a valid reason for the CICA to make such a decision. Human rights organization Liberty is appealing against the ruling. In the description below, I have included Liberty's Twitter handle, along with a few select Twitter threads that are relevant to the video. For example, the very Twitter thread that started this, along with others where people were tagged in and MPs. Although the MPs were a little silent, the others were not. Let's deal with that another time though, shall we? I'm sure they were busy with their duck ponds. Please go throw them a follow because they are doing fantastic work for this. Peter, not his real name, who needed psychiatric help for 5 years following the abuse, told The Guardian he was shocked and distressed by CICA's decision. I was a child being manipulated and used. After years of people telling me men were in the wrong and I was a victim, having a government-linked agency telling me it was all consensual was very, very upsetting. I can't believe we're actually having to fight them on this. I feel like they're saying you did this to yourself, so why should we help you? Due to a lack of clarity on CICA's part, I am unable to ascertain the criteria they work by where they were able to come to such decision. They have publications, but none of which are criteria or decision-making related, which makes it very hard to come to a conclusion that is not what he believes and I believe to be victim blaming, which is not a valid reason. We hear this enough in many arguments in many different circles. It is unacceptable. Peter's mother, Emily, not her real name, described the ruling as cruel and callous. Our son was abused by all these vile men who were sent to jail, and yet he can receive no compensation, she said. It's just beggars belief. Now, this is something that comes up later in this article about how this compensation is obtained. It is a taxpayer scheme, and so, of course, the taxpayer pays for the compensation. What I'm interested in is why is the compensation not taken from the culprits? Why do they not have assets seized? Why is it not them that pays? Now, granted, some of them had families, but let's face it, if you're that stupid to molest a child, so stupid and irresponsible and sick to molest a child, I sorely doubt for a second you have any level of responsibility or competence to be a family man. And in this case, it is family man because all 21 of those criminals are male. Peter met his abusers online after coming out as gay and setting up profiles on a number of dating sites, hoping to find people to talk to who would understand what it is like to be a gay teenager. He was always open about his age. I want to, for a moment, postulate something. If 21 men are convicted and sent to jail for grooming and other such sexual offences and sign a sex offenders register, the police would have had to have found sufficient evidence, i.e. chat logs, that showed quite clearly grooming, along with any other evidence obtained later on after certain activities that are far too sick to describe. Does CICA have such access to those chat logs? Because if it did, it also then would know that child grooming was taking place. If this is in fact the case, then CICA are doubling down on the victim-blaming side, after drawing their own conclusion from the evidence obtained. In this instance, with the evidence and the court ruling, they should abide that. There is no logical reason to draw an alternate conclusion. Many of the men convicted who were in their 20s, 30s and 40s were made to sign the sex offender register and banned from working with children. In its appeal, Liberty says the blindness of CICA, a governmental body, to the fact that an appellant was a vulnerable child victim of sexual exploitation is extraordinary. It is irreconcilable that the repeated public pronouncements by the government on the vulnerability of children to sexual grooming and abuse. Indeed, the tone of the decision suggests that CICA considers the appellant to be culpable for any harm he has suffered as a result of the sexual liaisons he sought out. The subject of child sexual exploitation has become more and more openly discussed in Parliament since roughly 2013 during the Rotherham child sexual exploitation scandal. Now, these involved gangs that were being ignored by the police because they were afraid of being labelled racist or Islamophobic or other such labels that are quite frankly redundant. Rapist and paedophile seems appropriate. Now back to the subject of Parliament. Every so often the subject comes up, and every single time the Prime Minister or whoever is at the dispatch box says, we are clamping down, we are getting stricter, the rules are getting tighter, screening processes are getting better, and yet when a decision has to be made with regards to someone else by a government agency that reports to Parliament, they've decided to ignore him on the grounds that he consented, which he could not have done so, and it has already been ascertained he could not have done so. Add that to the fact that he was looking for people to talk to, not have sex with, and it's very hard not to see this as victim blaming, which I've said twice already. It reflects an attitude of victim blaming of a child that should have no place in the 21st century. Liberty's legal officer Debalina Dasgupta said it's shocking that a state body using public funds to argue that a 13-year-old chose to have sex with adults. Despite many of his abusers being convicted of grooming and sexual assault offences, Liberty believes CICA is breaching the victim's human rights and discriminating against him. So the Human Rights Act is a law that means you can defend your rights in the UK courts, and that public organisations including the government, the police and local councils must treat everyone equally with fairness, dignity and respect. Young or old, this applies and protects your rights. So in this instance where Liberty are claiming CICA are breaching the victim's human rights, does it not feel a bit like, because he is male and a lot of UK law denies that men can be victims, even though he was a child at the time, and there being significant evidence in the past of teachers, female teachers, abusing students and getting away with it to an extent. Now, I'm not going to turn this video into a men's rights video. It is not that at all. This case is a terrible instance where a government agency has given a weak excuse to deny someone what they are due, although I still think they should seize assets and award him that and anything else that is decided to be a suitable amount of compensation for everything he's gone through. Although whoever it is that has to come up with that number, I do not envy them. How do you quantify what this kid has gone through? The organisation argues that CICA has failed to take into account the age gap between Peter and his abusers, and his vulnerability as a boy who has just begun to explore his sexual orientation, which is a very reasonable argument to make, as all of the men involved that committed these heinous crimes were in their 20s, 30s and 40s. There were times when I couldn't leave the house, Peter said, of the impact of the abuse. If a man looked at me in public, I started having a panic attack. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I went through stages of self-harming. Emily described the events as truly horrendous, saying he went from being totally loving and close to us to barely talking to us. They completely took him over. We became the enemy. Everyone had to work so that Peter could realise it wasn't his fault. And now this one organisation can actually leave him with the message that he is to blame. It's not fair because he's never going to completely repair if this is in his head all the time. We have a boy who's had a dreadful 6 years and lost a huge part of his childhood, and we shouldn't still have to be fighting. This is where I am very happy that Liberty have stepped up in the way they have, and I would encourage MPs to do the same. Things like this should not be ignored. Politicians make a lot of statements with regards to child abuse, and they should act. Talking is one thing, but sorting out an actual mess that has damaged someone in such a way is very much needed if we're going to start making people feel like they are not to blame for what others do to them. CICA said it does not comment on individual claims. The Criminal Injuries Compensation Scheme awards taxpayer-funded payments to victims injured as a result of violent crime, a spokesperson said. Payments can only be made to those who meet specific criteria, but applicants can apply for review if they feel their case was not fairly assessed. If the applicant remains unhappy after the review, they can have an appeal heard by an independent tribunal. And thus we come to the argument earlier mentioned about criteria. What kind of criteria do you have where a 13-year-old boy that is looking for people to talk to understand his sexuality is groomed and sexually abused by up to 21 men, is not eligible for compensation after all of those people were convicted? And the judge even said he was not to blame, only for you to then blame him by saying he consented to the acts themselves. CICA. In this instance, I would recommend you review your criteria, as they have failed someone that has suffered for a very long time. Not that I have the faintest understanding of how you make these decisions, but your very specific criteria has left someone out, left someone behind, and has left them feeling like they are the problem, like they are to blame for what happened to them. For that, you should be ashamed. Thank you all for listening.